我们都知道，在投资市场上，投资人为了获得高回报，是会踊跃的承担风险的。但是如果这个风险过高，投资人已经开始对它产生质疑的情况下，投资人也会毫不留情的撤资，并且对被他们造成损失的责任方进行严格的追究责任、严格的惩罚。在过去这周的节目中，以及我们过去这一周中陆陆续续为大家追踪报道的中国公司在美国上市的状况当中呢，我们就看到了很多中国公司的股票在美国市场上表现的是相当的优异，但是也有一些公司呢撤牌，并且遭到了投资人集体诉讼。在今天的财经观察单元当中，我们就如何避免遭到美国投资人集体诉讼，如何提高自己的这个法规的标准达标程度，同时呢，又如何在国际金融资金大流通的环境下，建立一个全球统一监管的体系，以有力的提高公司融资的效率，同时也有效的保护投资人利益的问题呢，进行讨论。那我们今天呢，特地请到了在华尔街德高众望，并且专门代表投资人利益的律师事务所泽曼斯基律师事务所的总裁以及高级合伙人 Jacob Zemansky 成为我们的嘉宾。
I know lately you were handling some of the Chinese case being sued by U.S. investors. Could you give me a brief introduction? How did that come about, and why? How did that caught your eyes?
Sure. We've been getting calls from investors in Chinese stocks that are listed on the United States exchanges to see why the stocks fell in value so much. And what we've done and through our research is to see that there was a lot of alleged fraud taking place. In many instances, two sets of books, one cash book, one book supplied to the auditors, and that many companies were fabricating financial statements, not honestly reporting their sales, revenue, and profits. So we've been asked to look into it, and there are a number of cases that have already been filed in the States, and there'll be many more.
You represented the investors from the U.S.
Correct.
Have you ever get in contact with those companies already?
Beginning stages, a few class action lawsuits have been filed. We'll be joining those. We may be bringing others. And one of the other things we're doing is researching what the disclosure requirements are between our Securities and Exchange Commission and the China SAIC, because they're giving one report to the SEC, one different report to the SAIC, and we want to harmonize that and also see what type of accounting problems there are.
What are the most frequent complaints about Chinese company?
Well, we're hearing that, again, that they're false financial statements, or that they're using auditors that are not known. They're not using Big Five auditors. And most of these companies are doing what's called reverse mergers. A Chinese company that wants to get listed in the U.S. will find a shell corporation that's not doing business but has a listing. They do a reverse merger into the U.S. corporation, and then they go and do an initial public offering. So with that listing comes disclosure obligations in the United States that are not being met.
So the reverse merger itself is a appropriate way of speed up a listing in the United States. But right after the reverse merger, you want to move up to the main board. You need to do things the U.S. SEC requires you to do. So that's where the Chinese company run into trouble, because they don't do it.
Right. Now, again, some of the problems with reverse mergers, there are some stock promoters who started these mergers that have shaky histories. They've been involved in fraud before. One individual actually had served time in jail for fraud. So we have to screen out mergers that are of legitimate companies and those that are being pumped by fraudulent stock promoters. But then comes the accounting. We have to have audited financial statements. The information has to be verified. They have to do due diligence to make sure that they have the customers who they say they do, that the revenues and profits are there. So therefore, we need a reputable audit firm. There are a lot of multinational firms that can do this. But if the firms are not allowing the auditors to see the true books, it's a big red flag, and investors probably should stay away.
So it sounds like most of the problems is because of the promoters and advisors. It's not really the Chinese companies themselves. They are not being properly advised of what they should do.
Look, China is a booming economy. Many U.S. investors want to invest. They want to be part of that growth. They're good hard workers in China. The problem is they have to comply with U.S. law, and U.S. procedures. Maybe they're not familiar with it. Maybe they need to have good advisors. So that could be a big problem. But once they understand the system, if they have a good product, if they've got good customers, they're going to make money over here. But there's just a certain way of doing business that they need to understand.
Mm-hmm. Are there any these kind of cases the Chinese company itself is actually a fraud? It's no such a business, nothing. They just cook up something.
Well, there have been a number of cases that have been reported. Barron's did a study. The Barron's newspaper did a study of some of these. Rhino, R-I-N-O, was just delisted today. Their earnings are apparently fraudulent. Orient Paper was a study by Muddy Waters. The research firm showed that they were falsifying financial statements, allegedly. China Merchant Food Company. So there are a whole bunch of Chinese companies that either intentionally or unintentionally have given out false financial statements. That makes people worried here, and there are going to be lawsuits.
So at the beginning, when they are allowed even to list it on the main board, shouldn't be that the exchanges and also regulatory entities burn some burden to prove how do they even approve such a fraudulent document?
What's happening is you have a good Chinese company doing a reverse merger and getting listed in the U.S. Now, our Securities and Exchange Commission can't go over to China and check and do due diligence. They won't do that. And the Chinese authorities may not have an interest in seeing what's going on in U.S. listings and what affects U.S. investors. So there's this sort of regulatory gap. And therefore, the companies have to do the right thing themselves. They need to get competent securities lawyers that know the rules in both places, legitimate accounting firms, and stay away from fraudulent people. If they do that and they've got good products, they'll be very successful.
Mm-hmm. As you just mentioned, there's a regulatory gap between two different countries. How can you solve this problem?
I think there probably should be a decision by the U.S. regulators to have regular meetings with the Chinese authorities, to have joint protocols set up so that everybody knows what the rules are. But you raise a good question. With the regulatory gap, the two agencies should really be speaking to each other, because this is a big part of our future, that there's a big need to have the two countries act as a global relationship so that we have trust in Chinese companies and Chinese companies can do business here and make money.
以上就是这节的环球财经单元，谢谢您的收看，我是庞哲，我们下期同一时间再会。现在将现场交回在香港直播室的主播任任。